They left me standing on a narrow cobbled street, and then they drove away as if it were a practical joke. For a long second, their taillights were the only proof that I had been part of something that no longer wanted me. Could being abandoned be the beginning of anything at all, I asked myself, or was it the end I had always feared? I had come to the tiny Italian village with a suitcase full of hope and a marriage certificate that had grown thin at the folds. Now my pockets held €80, a worn passport, and an old ring that used to mean commitment. I would like to say that I made a plan right then, but what I remember most vividly is the smell of frying oil from a nearby osteria and the rough heat of the stone wall against my back as I slid down until I sat on the ground and let the evening arrive. Stay with me, and you will see how a humiliating exit from a life I thought I wanted turned into the seed of freedom I never imagined planting. If stories of reinvention speak to you, subscribe for more true accounts of women who plant roots again. I grew up in a quiet Connecticut suburb, the kind of place with painted porches and homeowners who kept their hedges trimmed like promises. My mother taught me to sew, and my father taught me to fix a leaking faucet. I studied architecture because I loved the way buildings held stories. In my 30s, I moved to teach and to love. Antonio, the man I married, was charming on stage and distant at home. For years, he spoke of possibilities while I stacked our life into boxes and saved his smiles for guests. There was a slow eroding, a pattern of small betrayals that I ignored because I believed in partnership. When my job offer in Florence came, I quit the long commute to take a leap for us. That choice folded into every later regret. I traded a skyline for tiled roofs, and for that gift, I will always remind myself that choices are both risk and chance. After the divorce papers and the calm, polite voice of a lawyer, I found that the shape of my identity was not gone, just misplaced. At the moment they left me, the ring felt heavier than the weight of the years because it carried the imprint of promises I had kept alone. The first night I slept in a pension with a cracked lamp and a radiator that clanged like an old kettle. I counted my money while the town clock struck, and then I took a walk to a market square that smelled of lemon and warm bread. My hands smelled of petrol from the bus stop, and my throat carried the dry salt of suppressed questions. I tried my phone numbers. Antonio did not answer, and his friends laughed when I called. I knocked on a few doors, and no one seemed to remember the American with quiet eyes who had once been seen at a cafe. In the pension, I left a note for the owner, Lucia, and I wrote simply, "I will not be a burden." In the morning, I went down to sell the ring. The pawn shop was small and lit by a single bulb. The man behind the counter was Pietro, a broad-shouldered man with a face like weathered bread. He looked at the ring like he could read my ledger of losses. "How much for it?" I asked, my voice thinner than I intended. "Not much," Pietro said, and tapped the glass with a finger that left a grease print. "It is good gold," he added, and weighed hope like metal. "I won it years ago," I lied. "Well then, it has a price," he answered. "Will it pay for a ticket?" I asked. "Perhaps a seat to somewhere less familiar," he said. "Do you have family?" he asked, and I shook my head. "Then it is only you and the road," he said. "I do not know the road," I whispered. "Many do not at first," he said, and named a bus that might take me along the coast. The exchange was clumsy, the way the world is when it has decided to stop caring about your plans. When Pietro handed me folded bills, the shop smelled of old paper and orange peel and the slightly metallic tang of coin. That night, I bought the last seat on a bus that went east toward the sea. On the bus, the landscape slid by in a palette of olive green and the brown of plowed fields. The seat smelled of sunscreen and exhaust. I slept poorly and woke with the taste of coffee grinding at the back of my tongue. At the terminal, a wiry woman with wind-laced hair offered me a cigarette and a look that said, "Come," and I did. Her name was Elena, and she had hands the color of sun-baked clay. She led me through lanes that smelled of rosemary and seaweed and toward a village that seemed to fold into itself like a secret. I thought at first she was a savior, and perhaps she was. But she was also practical and blunt, and the first person to tell me that pity was useless if it was not followed by work. She introduced me to others by the names they earned in the village. Marco, the baker, who never smiled at tourists, but who taught me how to fold dough like a promise. Rosa, the school teacher, who offered me a room above her shop for a small rent. Luca, the pharmacist, who pushed a packet of activated charcoal into my hand when anxiety made me lightheaded. Matteo, the fisherman, who caught fish the size of small tragedies. And Francesca, the mayor, who scribbled my name into a ledger and asked simply what I could do. Each person did a small thing that felt like a raft. The first days were denial and a daily inventory. I counted money, passports, and the dress I had worn to our wedding. I learned which keys unlocked kindness. I slept in a room with a lopsided window and learned to wake when the light hit a certain tile on the floor. I went to the mayor, who explained in flat language that foreigners can register as residents if they intend to stay and work. The bureaucratic steps were simple to name and heavy to carry. You need a codice fiscale, proof of residence, and a declaration of intent at the town hall, then a permit to work if you will be paid. It sounded formal, like a promise written in official ink, and it made me feel less transient. I began making small jobs, folding tablecloths at Marco's bakery and sweeping the stone in front of the church. My hands learned new textures, flour and the rough green rind of lemons and the slick cold of fish scales. There was a single instant that decided everything. I sat at the quay watching boats and thinking about a man who had once told me that leaving was theatrical. I opened my suitcase and took out the ring and turned it in my fingers. The gold had a nick where once someone had hastily pried it off. A woman selling figs came by and offered me a smile that was almost a dare. I walked back to Pietro's pawn shop, and the bell above the door sounded like a small confession. The conversation there was not a scene of melodrama. It was a barter and an acceptance of necessary loss. "Do you regret it?" Pietro asked, and I thought of every small pardon I had made. "I regret the space it took up inside me," I said. I left with money and with the sensation that I had no place to put the absence of that circle on my finger. That act of selling the ring felt like choosing a brief clean cut over an ongoing ache. Soon after, I collapsed on a path between two terraces of olive trees. The heat pressed like a hand across my chest, and my legs simply stopped. I had been walking for hours because walking seemed like moving forward. My breathing sounded loud and absurd. A dog approached wagging, and then an old woman with a basket knelt down and put a cool cloth on my forehead. Her name was Nonna Rosa. Elena arrived with a car that coughed and with a thermos of tea. Her voice was practical. "You needed to collapse before you could stand," she said. The rescue felt ordinary and miraculous at once. They lifted me into a kitchen that smelled of garlic and tomato and placed me by a window where the light landed on an old wooden table. Elena tore bread with hands that had always known how to share. She said, "We do not ask about the past too much. We ask what you are willing to learn." That night I slept, not because I had recovered, but because for the first time in months, I did not have to explain myself to someone who owed me nothing. In the days of learning, I was taught by patient people who did not pity my history. Marco showed me how the heat of the oven changes dough, the way honesty changes relationships. He used words that cut clean, then held gentleness in the way he put his hands on a loaf. "Push not too hard," he said, and I felt the kind of correction that is also care. Elena showed me how to prune olive branches to let sunlight in. "You cut where it will breathe," she taught me, And then she pointed to a scar on her wrist that told me she too had been pruned. Matteo showed me how to mend nets and how to judge the weight of a good catch. Francesca took me to the market and set up a stall for my new product, a small, fragrant jar of herb-infused oil that smelled like early mornings. My first jars were rough, the labels crooked, the corks not tight, but people bought them because the village likes to buy beginnings. The task learning to press olives into oil and then to label and sell that oil gave me measurable hours in the day and an honest ledger at night. My muscles ached in ways that felt earned, and my breath matched the rhythm of the work. The transformation was technical and emotional. I learned to press olives. 250 to 350 words on process sounds unwieldy, but the practice demanded precision. You select ripe olives within 24 hours of picking, then wash and crush them cold to keep flavor. The paste is pressed and centrifuged to separate oil from water solids. Temperature control is everything. The method the villagers used was a blend of old stone presses and newer machines that hum quietly like bees. Elena and Marco taught me how to calibrate the press and how to test acidity the way you test a promise. The lesson was part chemistry, part patience. There were small conversations that built trust. At the market one morning, Rosa leaned over and pointed at my jars. "How many did you bring?" she asked. 12, I answered, and felt the number like a proposition. "We will take 6, she said, and paid me in coin and in recipes. Luca the pharmacist bought 3 jars for his sister who was ill. Pietro the pawn shop owner, who had once weighed my ring, bought 2 bottles and said, 'It is good with bread.' Marco placed an order for his osteria and said, 'We will serve it with fish.' Each name tied to an action stitched a map of support. Elena brought an old friend named Salvatore, who helped me register the business name and looked over my first crude invoice and wrote a note in the ledger in slow, careful script. Rough patches arrived like weather. Antonio called twice from a number I did not answer, and once he appeared in the square like an echo. The village saw him, and the osteria where he had stopped for a coffee filled with low conversations. The moment of confrontation was inevitable, and when it came, it was public and long and vital. He walked up the stone steps where I was stacking crates, and he said in a voice trained to charm, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I am living." He laughed and put his hand on a shoulder that he had not touched in years. "You cannot stay in town without papers," he said. "Who told you that?" I answered, and then we spoke until a crowd gathered. "Why did you leave me?" I demanded, my hand smelling of oil and earth. "You left us," he said, stubborn and precise. "You packed and left while I was at the office," he claimed, and his eyes sought sympathy. "You left me with your lies," I said. "I offered you an explanation," he persisted. Elena, who had been nearby, put down a crate and said simply, "This is not a court. Healed men talk in circles. We get tired." The exchanges spiraled into something raw and true. "You promised forever," I said. "Promises change," he offered, like a dictionary definition. "So do people," I replied. Marco said from the back, "There are people who come here for refuge and people who come for performance. If you have words, show us paper." I reached into my bag and handed him photocopies of divorce papers that I had begun to prepare with Francesca, the mayor's guidance. He opened them and his face changed like weather. And then he said, "You will not take anything from me." And I said, "I will take what I earned." The back and forth lasted with 6 to 8 exchanges, where voices rose, then fell, and where the legal paper felt like a quiet truth landing on a table. In that square, amid the olive crates and the chatter of the market, I signed for myself a small contract that translated into autonomy. After the public scene, I added the final legal steps with the help of a local lawyer named Julia, who explained in plain language that a separation recognized abroad requires documentation, local translations, and a signed declaration at the consulate. The core of the process is clarity of proof of residence and a notarized statement. The real work was less paperwork and more the endurance of showing up to sign and to speak the truth. It took weeks filled with appointments and stamps and small waiting rooms where I learned to hold my breath without collapsing. My business grew by slow, trustworthy inches. At first, I sold to neighbors, then to the osteria, then to the markets in nearby towns. I learned pricing and an honest margin and how to wrap a jar so it did not rattle. Francesca helped me design a small sticker that read root oil in handwritten script, and she introduced me to a distributor named Paolo who took a crate to a cafe in a city an hour away. The first real payment came in cash, a small bundle that felt like the sound of a bell. I placed the money in the tin and then paid Marco for flour and Elena for a stack of bandanas I used to wrap jars. The exchange of money felt like breathing again. The village became a community of people who kept me steady and asked little and offered everything. At a festival one evening, the square filled with lanterns and music. Nonna Rosa brought a plate of fried zucchini, and Matteo brought a catch that the chef at Stavros's restaurant roasted the way the sea remembers salt. The oil I had made was drizzled over each plate, and someone near the stage raised a glass and said, "To new roots." I tasted lemon on the air and felt in my chest a quiet that was not absence but presence. 1 month later, I had a small shelf in Marco's bakery and a signed business enrollment that showed my name. The first month was a collage of receipts and neighbors who stopped by with recipes and with advice. Elena taught me how to negotiate with wholesalers, and Francesca sat with me to fill in forms until I could do it without her. The money was small but steady, and the jarred oil sold because the label had a story and because the flavor was honest. I invited Lucia, the pension owner, to a dinner, and she told me stories of women who had come before and found footholds. The memory of Antonio's taillights remained, but it had lost the power to fold me inward. 3 months after that, my product reached 3 restaurants in the region, including Stavros, the one that mattered because Stavros was known in the county and because his customers had opinions that traveled. Paolo, the distributor, sent an email saying the cafe had reordered and included a short note that read, "The oil is vibrant and true." My list of names increased with each order. Marco, who bought bread for free sometimes, Salvatore, who gave me a crate discount, and Rosa, who recommended my jars to visiting friends. The community had become a second family, chosen and made of deliberate action. I had begun to pay a small stipend to Rosa for recipe testing, and I hired Francesca's niece to help with labeling on busy mornings. 6 months into this new life, the town organized a market day, and I rented a stall with Elena and Matteo. We sold jars and bread, and there was a moment where a man in a suit approached and asked if I would supply a boutique in the city. The deal was modest, but it came with a contract and a deposit. I signed with Julia, the lawyer, looking on, and folded the pages with the same care I had for my first invoice. The deposit bought me a new press and a pair of boots that did not leak. My name appeared in a local paper, and the headline read, "American Woman Plants Roots in Coastal Village." People I had only known by sight came by to congratulate me. The village felt proud, as though it had raised something and then watched it stand. There were losses along the way. Letters from the old life arrived, and sometimes I read them until my eyes blurred. I burned some pages in the fireplace with Elena watching and added salt to the ash. Other things I kept, like a photograph of my father and a recipe card my grandmother had written. The tension between remembering and moving forward was not resolved. It was managed each day by the work of living fully. I planted an olive sapling on a ridge that looked over the sea, and I watered it like a ritual. The physical work rewired the lines of grief into something that could support new growth. If this story has touched you, I want to ask something simple. Many of the people who watch these accounts are carrying a choice or a moment of fear. If you were in my place, would you ask family for help, or would you try to leave on your own? Write family or alone in the comments and add one sentence why. Your small note could be the map someone else needs. These comments create a community of practical responses, and sometimes that community changes decisions. Your voice matters more than you know, and each story shared becomes a possible road for someone else. Today, I still wake early, and I still oil jars on the same table where Nana Rosa taught me to knead bread. My business now supplies 5 small restaurants and a boutique store 3 months larger than before, and a steady stall at the market. The contract with the distributor is modest but stable, and it has allowed me to hire 2 part-time helpers, Luca's sister and Francesca's niece. Elena and Marco remain my mentors and my friends. Antonio finally signed a final paper that confirmed our separation, and the act of that ink was anticlimactic and necessary. The village gave me a life that did not rely on another person's approval, and that autonomy tastes like sun-warmed oil and warm bread. I do not tell this story to glorify leaving. I tell it because sometimes cruelty pushes open doors we were too afraid to test. I learned how to choose work that honors my hands and how to ask for help in ways that left space for pride. The small jars of oil are more than product. They are proof that a life can be rebuilt one honest task at a time. Thank you to Elena, Marco Pietro, Rosa Luca, Matteo, Francesca, Salvatore, Giulia, and Nana Rosa, who each held a piece of the rope when I learned to climb again. If this story moved you, subscribe to hear other real women who turned sudden endings into new beginnings. Remember that a closed door can sometimes be the signpost to a road you were always meant to walk.